All right, so to get started, what I wanted to do is give you all a brief orientation to Guide Rails, kind of take you through the sales presentation. I will give you a brief high-level orientation of the platform, and then we'll start to dive down deeper into topics. I'll hand over to Yoga, and we'll go down into pipeline onboarding and the various different features within the platform. Before we get started, any questions or can we jump straight on in? All right, I will take it as jumping straight on in. Okay, so why are we here today? The promise of DevOps, and I think you all know DevOps pretty well. It can make coffee for you, it can wash your car, speed up delivery, tame complexity. However, the practical realities are really quite different than that. Gartner's Secrets to DevOps Success actually cited that 90% of DevOps initiatives will fail to meet business expectations by 2023. It's a pretty staggering amount when you consider that almost every company right now that does software in some shape or form is doing DevOps. Some of the challenges that we see is as they go across this journey, generally gluing together tools and bringing in various different frameworks, they start out, they get initial progress, and then they hit this island of automation, maybe within one application component or within one area of the stack. As you expand on that journey and you bring more systems into the platform, you start to hit challenges and inconsistencies around communication. You scale that up even more, and then you start to lose the lack of visibility and oversight. And in many organizations, you have a rebound effect where bureaucracy and control comes in place in order to tame this. And that ultimately then puts friction into the system. And as you go through this entire process of kind of DIY approach to DevOps, that journey for most organizations takes somewhere between 5 to 10 years or even longer. Well, the benefits with Guide Rails is we can get you there within a week to a quarter. And we'll show you how we actually do that a little bit later on this morning. So talking about some of those key failure patterns that we see, by this point, we've spoken to most of the Fortune 500 and a good chunk of the Global 2000. And there's four main patterns that we see. The first one is that bring your own, bringing in Jenkins, adding on a bunch of other tools and frameworks, and trying to put that out as an end-to-end platform. That has some challenges with it. And I'm sure that Walid, you're very familiar with those. It goes around maintenance, capabilities, and the overhead of that. Then you come into the homegrown platforms. Missing key capabilities again. A lot of the times by this point, you have unhappy users as developers because there's friction in the system or they can't see parts of the application to debug. And as that system grows out, it becomes the highest of all in cost, generally in maintenance and in headcount in order to manage the platform. Around 5 or 6 years ago, we started to see what we call DevOps 2.0 platforms hit the market. And these were considered at the time best of breed, but they're a little bit like having a kit car. You still have to build a lot around it and assemble it. The challenge with these is they don't go end to end. They become a maintenance nightmare, and it's very, very difficult to get common processes. They're also usually SaaS-based and limited, so there's also other security considerations to bear in mind there as well. And then lastly, Kubernetes. A lot of buzz in the industry, a lot of companies thinking about Docker. Yes, Kubernetes certainly does add value. Docker certainly does add value, but it does also introduce a whole host of problems, and it only really solves part of the deployment problem. Now, the other challenge that we see may not apply to PMI so much is the majority of engineers' times in a lot of large organizations is actually going to managing the process. Managing that promotion of artifacts, the dependencies, meetings, and so on, and not actually developing code. In a lot of organizations, that amount of waste can be as high as 80% of an engineer's time. So the key capabilities and value of Guiderails. On one side, what we bring to the developer is full lifecycle self-sufficiency. So software delivery orchestration end to end. You as a developer on your commit, Guiderails will provision your application components, its dependencies as you define them. It will bring up a whole ephemeral test environment for you. It will run the tests on that and then destroy it at the end if you've set it up that way. It's the same process whether you go to a server, a VM, or a container, whether you go to AWS, Azure, GCP, VMware, or bare metal. In our platform, we've also built in configuration and secrets management, and we don't preclude you from bringing in any open source tools that you need to use for your business ends. On the other side, we balance that with fast feedback and actionable insights. We provide clear work in progress reporting. So who's working on what, when, which branches? How is the throughput of the team performing? So time to market analysis. At all times, you have real-time quality metrics throughout, both at engineering level and in leadership. And security and audit support is baked in throughout the platform. So everything at rest, everything on the wires, fully encrypted. You have full traceability from every commit all the way through to the production deploy. So hopefully as developers, that makes you a lot more efficient. So in doing that, generally what we see is the developers end up spending about 2 times more coding and not dealing with the process. And with that built-in audit and compliance, and you may see this as you scale up at PMI, that delivery process moves from months to days and much closer to a continuous delivery model. And hopefully by that point, you end up with a complete car. So I wanted to give you actually a real world example of one of our customers. This is a large global bank that had invested 10 years and over $100 million in their platform. And you may recognize some of these tools up here on this left-hand corner. Their technical decisions were okay, but in the essence of gluing together these tools, even though automation existed, there were a lot of manual checkpoints along the way. And that really resulted in a 3 to 6 month delivery process. As they moved to Guiderails, they wanted to leave a couple of manual steps in here, but everything else was automated out. All the transitions across teams, so boundaries with networking, security, and so on. Everybody's working from a common set of tools and framework. And the deployments went to less than an hour once their code's ready. So Guiderails really provides those consistent results, reliable behaviors, and really gets you through that test and release cycle much more efficiently. And as developers, you're the ones in control. So the other thing around this is we all have specific areas of focus as SMEs. Now, if you consider the market today, DevOps experts are incredibly expensive, and now companies are also competing at a global market scale. Similarly, on the other side, you see a lot of kernel developers that are also in high demand. The goal of Guiderails is to bring the developers that sit in these areas, allow them to really focus on what they know best, application development, and make them have the capabilities that the unicorns do. So we enable most developers to act like unicorns, right? And that comes today with the processes that we went through, but also in future, we're looking towards delivering AI copilots, both for the developer and for management, production monitoring, real-time configuration, and also Meta Cloud Platform. So I'm going to jump over the delivery maturity models within DevOps. I think you're all mostly familiar with these. So let's actually cut through some of the slides now on the platform. This is actually our engineering console, and this is commonly used by leadership And as well, it also is a good wall board to have up in the organization. At any point in time, you can see the delivery trends. This is that feature lead time that I mentioned. You also have all your application components in a leaderboard format here. You can see who's working on what. And we also have the DORA metrics in here as well. So delivery frequency, lead time, number of commits, your change failure rates, and so on. And this is aggregated at the component level. And when I say component, normally I'm thinking about a microservice-like component with a one-to-one mapping with a Git repository, just for taxonomy. Moving on, the engineering console, you get a pipeline view top center. Down the right-hand side is your telemetry. So you get coverage, security, check style, find bugs, your standards, duplications, and so on. You can also see any changes that have come through from last run. So imagine your pipeline has just went red. You may be able to see here that Robert just changed a password, and that is what broke it, right? So that's the sort of thing that you can see. This really accelerates your troubleshooting and allows you to get back to a green pipeline as quickly as possible. Configuration as code. We pretty much deal with absolutely everything as code, from our property management system here on the left-hand side to bill breakers, which can be set and managed at any level, to role-based access controls, and then actually the pipeline definitions themselves. And I'm going to let Yoga go into this in more depth a little bit later on. So the value, ephemeral environments. I want to actually share this slide because I'm actually going to bring up Service Bridge, which is a component within Guide-Rails that sits behind our UI. So when we actually get a commit on UI, it's going to bring up its full set of dependencies and integration, right? So from that, excuse me, it has a Selenium test driver, which also connects into console for dynamic DNS. You got the UI's dependency itself, and then also the user guide. In turn, Service Bridge is here on this stack, brings up itself. It has a dependency on auth service and also on LDAP. And then there's a whole host of Guide-Rail services that sit independently of that. Those are brought up as dependencies. And then those dependencies then bring up the data layer dependencies below those as well. Now this all happens fully automated based on the commit on this one pipeline. Does this make sense so far? Can you all hear me?
Yes, it makes sense.
Okay. Just want to check my audio was working. Okay. So what do customers love? So from a development perspective, that's self-sufficiency. One place to go, no looking at 20 tools. You now have the ability to test your code, your configuration, and infrastructure together. And once you build a package in Guide-Rails, it is reusable anywhere else, consumable by anyone else in Guide-Rails. And once you build it, generally you can deploy to any environment, whether it be isolation, integration, UAT, production, or even something else very, very easily with very few changes. From a management perspective, one easy place to find the truth. You allow your developers that autonomy, but you can always still keep a good view of what's going on. Security shifts far left and becomes part of the process. So bringing in security analytics, whether it be static or dynamic scanning, as early as build, and sometimes even before. Bringing in secrets management, the patching process is diminished significantly. And security engineers generally then focus on prevention, not remediation. And as I mentioned earlier, this is all real time all the way through. From a business perspective, accelerated time to market, higher productivity, and hopefully happiness as developers, much more predictability, allows you to focus more on innovation, And then hopefully that will get you somewhere between 2x to 10x faster speed to delivery. So let me just swap over for 1 second, and I will actually bring up Guidereels itself. Okay. So can everybody see the UI now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So this is the engineering console and where most developers spend their time. At Calculi, generally, our developers will have Guidereels on one screen, their IDE in the other, and that's generally how they do their work day to day. So across the top here, I have my pipeline view. You can always see by segment when it was last run. You can see what the latest production version is here. I can click in and get details on that if I want. The yellow bar that you see here actually means that there's a manual approval step here into production. So if I click on that, I should see some versions pop up. I can pick up a version. I get a set of release notes for that version. This one's not particularly interesting. I'll go back one and see if there's more in that one. Okay. It will give you the pipeline states on any of those points in time. You will get all of the Jira stories in that release. You will get the commit IDs, the SHA-1 hash, all of the developers who authored that, and then actually the commit comments as well. So you get a full manifest and BOM of your release notes. A deployment is simple as clicking deploy here. If you have the appropriate role-based access controls. That will then kick off the deployment model. Guidereels uses a Canary deployment model, so it will put one instance out. It will actually Canary that. You can run health checks against it, etc. If that's successful, it will move on with the rest of your services and so on. But there's no automation scripting needed. That is all just out of the box within the platform. The engineering console itself, you get your job steps here. Logs are searchable. You also get logs for not only the pipeline, but also the deployment targets. So you can also see what is happening at a system level as well, accelerating your debugging and troubleshooting. Release notes are here. And if you need to kick off a pipeline manually, you can do that here as well. Jobs can also be scheduled here as well. So let's say I wanted to do an integration test, for example, and run it out overnight. I could select that, I can schedule it, and Guidereels will go ahead and it'll run that overnight or whatever. But generally, if it's not scheduled out, it is direct flow. It will just promote through as long as your tests are sufficient and you're passing those bill breakers. Coming down the right-hand side, I can see my code coverage and it's current over last run. So yellow right now just means that we're not hitting the organizational target for this component. Bill breakers and Guidereels are a little bit different than kind of traditional Jenkins style bill breakers, and we'll cover that in a little bit. Security issues would be here. If these panels are expanded, there are issues that you need to look at. So you can see here, I have coverage, standards, and duplication. If I go into coverage, I can actually get all the way down to line level details if I need to, and actually see those in context. All right, so if I click down, I can now see it is we have coverage issues. I can also see where there's code smells. There's a to-do there. So think about the PR process, right? Now you're bringing together a complete view of your linting, check style, static analysis, security, etc., etc. So as we use this tool internally, I really value the quality that this adds to PRs generally. And we will be expanding this over time, that you'll actually be able to do a full PR out of this screen here. Same holds true for duplications. And I also have my DORA metrics. So over the last 30 days, this component has gone to production 23 times. On average, it's 1 day, 23 hours for release, and there's 128 commits. Change failure rate, mean time to recover, and min-max, etc. I also have my test results here, what was executed, success rates, skipped, and so on. And that's also broken out for build and integration. As I mentioned, you can see changes here coming through the pipeline. This is not only for code changes, but also property changes. So things like passwords or secrets or even general properties. You'll see what changed, who changed it. So it's really easy to start to have those dialogues when something goes wrong. You see the properties here, and then we have the commit activity along the bottom. Now, pipeline configuration itself. And please don't be too intimidated by this screen. This is a pretty complex example I'm showing you. So on the left-hand side, we have our properties. And right now we're looking at this within the hierarchy of company of Calculi, within the Guide-Rails product line or division. The product is Guide-Rails itself. The component of that is Service Bridge, and we're on the master branch. These are all the properties associated. It can go all the way up to the company level. And now I actually see configuration. So for us, you can see that we have cloud providers. We're in US East, US West. We have multiple LDAP configurations. We have RBAC control set up at this level. We have tool configurations for SMTP. We set up default OS types and versions, and we've set up a number of properties at this level as well. Coming down to the product now, you see the same view, but you can see now there's additional stuff added. So at this product level, the team's added in Slack notifications. And there's also email notifications here as well on success or failure. And when it comes to properties, you can also see what has been inherited from above. And then any of the blue is being added at this level. If it is in red, it has been overridden. Doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just means that it's been overridden at this level. Again, with that theme of radiating data at all levels, right? So it becomes visible. And then as you can see here from the quality gates, we have a red, a yellow, and a green. Green is essentially your organizational target. Yellow just means that you're not meeting it. Where you mark this red one is important. That is going to be your hard break. That will fail the build, right? So slightly different way to think about it. There are sliders that we can do for many things in many different areas. So for example, around security, if you move towards deeper security scanning, you'll be able to see sliders around major issues, minor issues, criticals, and so on. So those all get exposed as well and give you much more gates to work with. So in short, any of these properties can be set or overridden at any level, right? We take very much that notion of convention over configuration. And then coming all the way back down to Service Bridge itself, let's actually take a look at the pipeline. Whoa. All right. So the pipeline itself, you can see here that you can add segments by clicking up here, just dragging them in. Our build steps, I'll let Yoga go through these, but a lot of these are property driven. So you can see here, we're pulling in application name and parens. That just means we're going to reference it as what it's called, service bridge. In this scenario, we're bringing in integration tests. It's written in Golang, so we're bringing in GoTools. We're bringing in test data and packaging that up, both for integration and UI. And we're kicking off some tasks there as well. Now, as you go over and you start to look at integration, you can see here, this is going out to a lot of different AWS targets and VPCs. So multi-region, minimum of 3 AZs within each region, fairly complex deployment. But again, all property driven by those dependencies that I actually showed you in that keynote slide earlier. Where it really starts to get interesting is here. So you can see I can define the inputs as those packages that were defined in the build steps. Here, my deployment strategy is easily configured. It's where I set up those canaries, how many I want in flight any given time, how much time I want to wait for those canaries to sit there. If I want to persist it and keep it up for debugging purposes, click this, and the integration environment will stay up. But generally, we work on a principle for integration that we tear down as soon as the environment is done running its tests. But that is a choice for you. Now, where it starts to get really, really interesting is in these instance groups. So this is that complex example that I showed you on the slides. So we start all the way up from here on Service Bridge. Service Bridge in integration, there's 3 instances. It's going into this cloud provider and it's on this VM type. And here is its direct dependencies here. It in turn has a set of dependent services. This is the number of instances of them, where they're going, and all of its direct dependencies there as well. That in turn has dependencies on DB service, which has dependencies on things like RabbitMQ. Now we get down into the data layer, Cassandra. That gets deployed in a ring, has dependencies on Vault and our secret service. That has dependencies on a web server and its direct dependencies, which has dependencies on workers and its own intermediate RDBMS for that as well. So you can see here, Guide Rails has just composed a stack of 26 to 30 microservices. All that component's direct dependencies in isolation for you as a developer to run out all of your tests. It will do all of that automatically. And when it's done, it will tear down the environment so that you can use your cloud resources efficiently. Make sense so far? All right, I know it's a lot to start off with. So let's jump over now to the dashboard and we'll look at this in real time. So on the left-hand side here, we have the feature lead time. On the far left here, you can see the dark green is actually time where stories are in requirements definition. So that's from when it hits the backlog to when it goes into ready to play state. On the aqua color, that's actually a time where it's in progress, test and dev. Red is where it's blocked. And if I click in on some of these, then you can come all the way down to the story level if you want. And if you're connected to Jira, you can click on this and go all the way back to the Jira story if you want. So if you think about things like sprint retrospectives or your team meetings, this gives you a lot of data to refine your agile process, right? So for example, this was a story that we got blocked on a customer. some dependencies that they had with their infrastructure teams. We can have that discussion as a team. How do we plan differently? How can we avoid that sort of thing in future, right? Same can hold true for your development process. Again, the same navigation tree across the top that you've seen on the engineering console. I have my DORA metrics here, aggregated at this level now for product. I can see my commits in blue. I can see what my lead time is. I can see what my change failure rate is. And then I also have quality scorecards down at the service level. Excuse me. Now, this actually applies to all the services under this product line, and it follows a leaderboard format. So generally, the larger the surface area, the better performing the component. The lesser the surface area, the lower performing the component. So you can see here, these are ranked like that. As I go down, these are my project management tickets from Jira that are actually assigned to me. So I have real focus on what I need to work on today. And then below, active development. So I can actually look at this by committers. And so for example, I can see that Yale's been working across a number of tickets. It's a good opportunity for me to check in with Yale, make sure she's doing okay. Is she blocked on anything? Is that what's causing so many tickets to be in parallel in work? Or is it just a complex problem, right? So these are the sorts of discussions now that you're able to see very, very clearly what is actually happening in real time from a development perspective. And finally, you get all the way down to deployments by service. So for example, you can get all the details back to the success, the instance ID of it, what its private IP is, which VPC it's sitting in, when it was launched, what status it's in, and also what life cycle it's in. So one thing we did not cover in much depth right now is around cloud management capabilities. The way that we set Guiderails up in our SaaS environment, by default, it takes advantage of Spot instances on AWS. So generally that can be anywhere between 30% to 70% off on-demand pricing on AWS. And Guiderails will actually, on your commit, go out and make a Spot request on your behalf. If it gets it within the regions that you have authorized it to deploy with, it will go ahead and do it. It can also be set up to fall back to on-demand if a Spot bid is not available, and so on. And then you get the last parts from the actual service themselves, when it was launched, etc., and so forth. And with that, I think I will hand over to you, Yoga. Any questions? Anyone? I know that was a lot to cover in 30 minutes, but I want to make sure that we got across the top end of the platform before we start drilling down into specific sections.
Just a side question. You showed AWS. Do you have integrations for Azure?
Yes. So we support AWS, Azure, GCP, VMware, bare metal.
Okay.
You can also do Docker as well. Are you thinking about going to Azure? Yeah.
Yeah, we need to test an Azure environment. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that we should chat about maybe on the side. There are very different performance characteristics on Azure that you might be interested in. So I'm happy to share that with you. Okay, and with that, I will hand over to you, Yoga and Vincent.
Right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Robert. I know everybody's quiet. I just want to check in again. How are you guys doing? Is it too much? Or you guys are still okay to observe the details of onboarding and looking at the closer into the pipeline itself.
As a backdrop, the idea is that we're going to use the system more and more instead of Jenkins. So yeah, and so hopefully developers here are thinking about what it means to be using this system.
Awesome.
I think there are sort of two parts though, like the configuration of it and then the usage of it. Right? I think most developers here are used to having use of it rather than configuration.
Okay.
Anyway, something to keep in mind.
Sure. Thanks, Yang.
Well, I do have one question on one of the comments you made earlier about the spot instances. So I'm trying to think about like how we're using it currently, our system currently. So we have persistent instances that are available to the team for performing testing. So when you talk about these spot instances, is it presumed that most of the testing is done through automation? And that's what enables you to use the spot instances.
Good question. So if you have a persistent environment that's going to be long-lived, probably a spot instance is not your best ideal, right? Because it's going to be up for a long period of time. You may remember that field that I was showing on integration where I set persistence to true. Once that is set as true, you're going to go to on-demand. That will just be up as long as you want that to be up until you actually take it down. But
what I was wondering about though is that the fact that you are using spot instances, does that mean your testing is like all automated? Is that the kind of the context that makes that work?
We recommend that you automate testing, but there's nothing in the platform that precludes you from leaving an environment up and doing manual testing. However, what we have done is we provide a good scaffolding that allows you as a developer probably to focus less on the process and some of the tools and actually work on the development and building out automated testing round about that. Ultimately, that's where you're going to get your speed over time.
Right.
If you're in a manual test mode, we don't preclude you from doing that. You would just leave the environment as persistent. Your QA folks would go in and do whatever they need to do manually. That's ultimately your decision. But we see a lot of customers with a tool like Guiderails suddenly starting to make much higher investments into test automation.
Okay.
Just to add on to that, Al, so the spot instances, when you have your services available, highly available, like you have 3, 4, 5 instances of your service running, and they're all running on spot, and even if one of the spot instances goes away because of there is a higher bid on it, and what happens is based on your spot range, Guiderails automatically tries to acquire another instance and redeploy your other one instance of it. So you still have 4 instances available. So it is just a cost control mechanism. You choose to either use that or not as well. We can turn off that, right? It's very easy for us to turn it off. What you saw is our release environment, which we have a multiple instance of each service running. And if one goes down, it automatically brings up another instance without user intervention. So that will also help you drive how you want to structure your deployments.
Okay. Oh, and then maybe one other question. So again, when you're looking at these spot instances, I'm presuming, like, particularly if you have a database behind it, and looks like you did have a database service. So would this be like the installation of a brand new kind of database instance, as opposed to like if you've got a customer, they have existing data, and then you're performing upgrades. So can you say anything about that process, like in terms of, how you go about simulating upgrades on existing
Sure.
data?
Sure. Robert, you want to take that or you want to take that?
Could you elaborate a little bit more, Al? I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly.
Okay, so let's say you've got, you have a 1.0 product, you've deployed it, okay? And your customer, they put all sorts of data into the system.
Yeah.
So then you come out with the 2.0 version of the product. It has upgrades to the schema. There's scripts that need to be run that, needs to modify maybe configuration files and content in the database. So could you describe how GuideRails, what kind of process you would have, for dealing with that kind of situation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that we can handle it, and you can also script within our job steps if you have specific ways of handling data layers. So there are some techniques for database updates. We'll just focus on what's happening right now on the mechanics of system. So I have V1.0 of a database. I have that attached to EBS volumes on a VM. You come through with 1.1. What generally will happen is if there's a software change, it will detach that mount. There will be a snapshot of that as well. It does that for you automatically. Generally, you'll detach a mount, you'll attach that to the new instance. And then let's say you're adding a table. You kick off your script that's going to add your table. It will run that. And then you go through. Now, as you're going towards continuous delivery, and you think about database operations like that, there's a couple of kind of interesting techniques that a lot of companies use for this. So for example, what they'll generally do is they'll add a new table on release 1, right? Release 2, they may hydrate that table and expose it on a new API. And then they come through quickly thereafter and deprecate away, say, an old table or something like that. So there's a number of techniques that you can use specifically for dealing with automated database updates.
Okay.
Those vary by whether it's relational, non-relational, but it's a great question. That is an area where a lot of companies struggle. I think we provided a good framework for dealing with that, but the mileage really is down to your selection of database itself, right?
Okay.
But there's some really good development techniques for handling those in a sane, manageable way.
Okay, thanks.
And also, just to add on to that, Al, so you can attach a persistent instance to your deployment, which means for database, like in our case, we have Cassandra, few instances of Cassandra running in our both release and prod. So we have persistent disk attached. And when you do a deployment, when you upgrade a deployment, the same persistent can get attached to that deployment, which means all your data, everything is intact. It's not going to be wiped out, even if it's a spot in no matter what, right? It's a persistent disk, it's just persistent disk. So it will get attached to your deployment at runtime.
Okay, great, thanks.
Alrighty. Any other questions before we dive in? All right. Can you guys see my screen, right? PML. Okay. Just want to confirm. Thank you. So this is your way to get to GuideRails, where PMI.calculator.io. This is more, it's a SaaS customer. We'll be using our production system. And this is the login that you will see when you come in first time. And I sent out individual emails with the creds and login name and emails passwords in a separate email for the new people that was added into the email yesterday. And then, of course, Al and Walid, you guys already have those logins created a while back for you and Yong.
Yeah, some of you may not have it, so I'll have to resend that out. Just inform me. Okay.
Sure. If you don't have it, definitely just let me know. I will resend those emails for you or reset the passwords for you guys. And just for this one, we are still using through our LDAP mechanism, our LDAP. So all that users are created in our system. So usually, basically, you come into Guide and click on the login, and then you provide your login and the password, and then you create agree for the agreement user license agreement, and then click login. That will take you to a welcome page of Guide, right? And the top navigation that you see is based on your roles and permissions that's been assigned and what projects, what organizations are available for you to look at. In your case, you will probably see PMI. Of course, I have a lot more, but this is what you will see by default when you come in. And then we have created 2 projects. I think we don't use this anymore, so we could just disable that when we are ready to do it. We created a project called Dev Team. And this is just how you can organize after PMI. You can organize different groups into your projects, or by line of business into your projects. And then the component is a one-to-one mapping with your repository, Bitbucket repository. So in this case, we have a dev team, and under the dev team, we have 2. One is the ET and one is the CPP. And let's go to ET. And by default, if we had onboarded a master branch, we would have seen that automatically populated. But in this case, we have 3 branches that's onboarded. One is the Guide Rails. I don't think we use these 2 anymore. We can decide to, turn them off. But this is the Guide Rails that we use, where we have onboarded this pipeline with Wallet and help of Al a while ago. And some of you helped behind the scene to get this whole pipeline onboarded and get the green build out of it. So this is, as Robert was talking to you guys about, this is the engineering console. This is where you come in every day to day. Once a pipeline is configured, you will have to go back to configuration only if there is some change in the way you want to deploy, or change in the way you want to build, or do anything like that. Otherwise, you'll stay here. And when you push a commit, the pipelines are going to get automatically kicked off. So where is this mapping to? Is you're directly mapping to your Bitbucket ET project by us Enterprise. So this component of Guide Rails is mapping to this, and for now, I think it's on the Guide Rails branch, right? So if someone makes a commit to this branch, this pipeline is going to automatically get kicked off. Okay. You can see some of the pre-configuration that happens. We show you everything, what happens behind the scenes, so that you don't just see the build. So we do some pre-configuration. We make sure we read your configuration at runtime when you make a commit, and we update the pipeline based on that. And that's what the logs you can see there. And then the next step is the build, and you can see all the steps that works inside the build. We can go to the configuration, I'll show you, but basically you can see the commit that happened, and you can see the commit SHA that we pulled for this run. And you can see some high level details about that, who committed it in the logs itself. And then you can see the ET, which is itself is the build step for this pipeline. So you will get a detailed log of everything that's happening behind the scene for you guys, right? So every job step that you have configured, that logs will be available. So this is very important when you have to debug something. Looking at these logs is gonna let you know what went wrong if build failed for your case, right? That's what that is. And then we do upload the logs so that you have the option to download them, and then we package your artifact. So we try to promote, build once, promote multiple times, right? I mean, build once, deploy multiple times. So because once you are doing a build, we don't want to have any manual process in between where any of your artifacts are going to get modified across, so that you have a consistent delivery cycle. So we package your artifacts, and then we also run a sonar analysis against your code. You can see those stats around here. And then we have a quality control, which means based on your control, you can, based on these parameters that we have set on a quality gate, this will either gonna break your build based on or not. So in this case, everything passed because we don't have a setup quality gate at this point in time, but it still runs through and says that, hey, there's nothing to break on. And then we just send out some events. So that's what that build section in details log is going to show you. And also you can see the changes that happen. And the commits that you see here are the commits from the last success run to current success run, right? So what gives you an idea of, so we just created this yesterday just to show you guys some examples of how things work. So in this case, we had some build run a long back when we actively worked on this. And then we had pipelines. And then yesterday we were trying to get through other stuff because we migrated to a new environment. But so you can see that commits keeps going to pile up because I made the commits. This one, this is second, that was not. So we can see that we made some commits, but something failed, build, because we had a quality gates enabled for your pipeline. So it kept on failing. We kept on trying with that just to show you how commits gets piled up here, right? So you can see, since this commit, you can see all the commits will be piled up as you go. So this will give you a good view of from last success to current success, what all the commits that happen. So this is what you can see that, right? So this is more here. You can navigate to get there. And then you can go to the view changes on there, where you will see the overall commit diff between the two runs. So, oops, what happened there? So this is just a guided JSON that happened, and you can see all the differences between the two runs. So this will give you a good view of what has changed. And then also you can see we kept making some changes to the properties, and you can see what properties are changed. So this is what matters when you have a deployment failures, because if based on a property change, if something goes wrong in your pipeline, hey, environment has changed. Somebody updated some property that's going to impact your deploying from integration to release or integration to production or isolation, so that you can track it. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see the commits that happened on this. So you can see there was no activity about this project. Obviously, we were not actively working on it. And then yesterday, we made quite a bit of commits that shows you that, hey, there was actively worked on. So this is, by default, gives you a month view, and you have the option to change and select a shorter or a longer term view. And this graph also picks up a deployments. When I say deployments, a deployment to production. If we have a production segment configured, in this case, we don't have one. So you don't see anything that got deployed to production here. That is because in line with the DORA metrics, because DORA metrics are for production deployment only. Right.
I have one question. Yes, yeah. Yes, I have one question. You say that every commit will start a new build, but let's say we would like to avoid starting new build for specific kind of commits. For example, some trivial commits where we have only when we change it only comments or something like that. To save resources, is there a way to prevent, to avoid building, to avoid starting new build after some specific commits? Can this be somehow?
No. So there are two options. We have a polling, which means we poll your repository that's configured every polling time that can be adjusted, which means every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. Or we have a webhook, which means every commit will trigger a pipeline. And we believe in, because these resources are, as I said, not very all ephemeral instances where you don't bring up the system and up and keep on running for them for long. So we promote every build will should run its own pipeline, right? So to answer your question, we could change it back to polling if you want to, but we don't recommend that, doing it.
There's also the option to manually build as well if you wanted to take that approach. But
Yeah.
again, the whole notion of as you invest in more automation and you begin to rely on the pipeline, you probably are going to want to do those builds more frequently. The smaller the batch size, just generally the higher quality that you're going to get because there's less things changing. If you stack up a bunch of commits and you wait, it's a late integration point, it's a late build. Normally you're going to have more issues on merges or builds just because the scope of change is much faster.
I think the challenge that we have is that the C++, the compilation time and the auto test take about an hour right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then the integration test can take, I don't know, like 10 hours or something like that, or 5 hours, I forget. And so I guess, yeah, the amount of compilation and testing might get pretty high, at least at the auto testing and automation testing, those kind of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, so for those, if you have the big jobs that are running overnight, you either want to probably set those up manually or scheduled. And then if you are trying to move towards a batch kind of build model,
so there is an option as well. I mean, we can disable obviously polling and your webhook. So, and then you manually come and kick off the build, the pipeline config. So, and what happens at that time is it'll pull the commits from the last commit SHA until the current commit SHA, and then it kicks off your pipeline. So we could work around that if need be, the worst case.
Okay, so yeah, we might need some policy for different repos for some duration until we optimize our automated testing to be faster.
Okay.
That's fine. We can work on that, yeah.
One more question, please. Is there any difference between commit and PR in terms of the actions taken?
Right now, we do not build on a PR. We are going to come up with that feature, in a short while, but today it's only commit. And then when the PR gets merged, and obviously the other pipeline gets kicked off because that's a commit there. Right. Any other questions before we continue?
Yeah, I do have one question actually, since Alex talked about the PR. So if we are thinking about changing the merge policy to fast forward, I don't know if you have any experience with that, but fast forward merging does not introduce a new commit in the target branch. So the question is, when we merge a branch, I assume that will not trigger any build with Gadrail, right? So there is a merge event, but there is no, and the same commit from the pull request will be moved to the target branch, let's say master or develop, but there is no merge commit.
There is no merge commit, that is fine. It doesn't need to be a merge commit as long as there is a commit. So I'm presuming even the fast forward will create a new commit SHA.
It's the same commit SHA.
Same commit SHA as the branch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's fine. But for the other branch, is still a new commit. So let's say you're branching on a feature one, and you merge that into develop maybe. And when you say, even though fast forward merge, and when that happens on the develop, you have that same commit as the branch commit, correct?
Yes.
And that is a new commit for that develop branch, and automatically build will trigger.
Yeah, that was my question. Thanks.
All right. So the next one is the static code analysis. This is mainly running the Sonar, but this will be integrated. The security we can integrate with other security tools like Veracode, and then I think we are trying to integrate with Coverity as well as we move forward. And right now in the ET project, we don't have any securities reported. And we have some bugs reported. And as Robert was showing you, you can go to the details of it. You will be able to sort on any of these columns that you have, and you can sort on the severity for you to pay attention to. And this can also drive, hey, is this a part of your dependency code, or is it your code itself? And based on that, you can adjust the exclusion criteria for your project. In this case, we did not go through any of that. This could be adjusted because it's a bootstrap, but at the end of the day, it's your application. We scan everything, and we want to put it up to the team, and then you have a take a call on whether you want to include this or not, right? And then it's categorized as a blocker. There are 5 categories by default. One is the blocker, critical, major, minor, and info. And the quality gates can be set on each level for you to control the build, pass, or fail on any of these issues. And similarly, standards, which will also show you a technical debt, overall technical debt, how long it might take. It's an approximation of to clean up this test, the linting issues. And again, they're all categorized in the same category. And they will, highlighting on the bar will show you each category and their numbers. And to drill down the same way, you can go to the drill down, and then you can sort by files, any of this. Clicking on the file itself will take you to the files, and you can navigate. This list will include every issues that we have encountered so far. What I mean by that is anything that has coverage, bugs, or a standards, or a duplication, all of that is part of this list that you have, so that you have one place where you can switch over and get the analysis against that. And also you have the option to select them so that you can see everything in one view, right? And this indicates whether you have issues or not. In this case, there are no duplications in this file, and there is one code smell, and there's one bug, and there are no security issues and coverage. So, and navigating this will show you to a bug, and they're all color coded. Based on this indents of color, you will see those highlighted. So in this case, this was a code smell, and the previous one was a bug, right? So that gives you a holistic view of this file, so you can just browse through them and fix the highest priority items in there. And test results, I think for this project, we went ahead and wrote some simple unit tests, and you can see those tests pushed into your repository. And this gives you the overall test that's happened in the entire pipeline. As you move from one stage to the other stage, if you have more tests, they will get aggregated. And in this case, we only have build, and we didn't have any integration tests. So you don't see any numbers for there. They're all, again, expandable, collapsible for you to view appropriately. So that is about engineering segment and selecting. You can go back and see up to last 50 runs. You should be able to see all the logs and every details that you have been going through. You should be able to see the same details at that point in time. So these security stats that you see is for current, in that case, will be 102 number, and the commit SHA for that would be this commit chart, and then you will be seeing the stats for 101, and it will show you here when the pipeline has ran. So this is gives you a history of how things have changed or improved or degraded. Right? So that's what, and then clicking on every segment will take you to the similar experience where you can be able to download the logs. When we say download the logs, download logs are available in two formats, TGZ and a zip file. And then this download log is not the entire logs. This is for your job step logs, which will cover in the onboarding what the job steps mean. In this case, anything that you run as your project build which is ET, we called it as, will be available for you to download as well.
Excuse me, Yoga. I have a question about the static analysis. So are there ways to configure what is checked in the static analysis?
Yes. So I will walk you through how do we add inclusion, exclusions stuff when we get to the onboarding screen.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
There are a couple ways of doing it. One is we can set that as a properties in guide rails, or you can always have a Sonar project files in your repo, so which you can customize up to every property level if you need to, and that will get applied at the runtime as well. That's another way of configuring it. So when we get to integration or any deployment segments, so you can see that we just did some packaging here, and then we have a integration segment that's actually deploying your application. The logs that you will see is for the deployment logs and a job step log. Any test that you execute will be available, and then these will be, if you have multiple tests, when I say multiple steps run as a different tasks, they will all be available for you to download by step. So that's what the logs are for. You can also see the deployment log that happened here. You can see some regions where it is getting deployed and details about your dependencies as well. That's a lot of to go through if you want to. And at the end, we can see that we created a VM at the, for the integration, and then we updated. When you say updated, it means that we deployed the application on that VM, and then after that we ran a test, and the test outputs are here. In this case, we just ran a very simple steps here. We just showing all the ports that was open when the application came up, and then we just hit a localhost 5000, I guess. The endpoint, just to make sure that, hey, it's the application, very basic in this case, right? But as you develop more into your application, you will be able to start seeing all the logs in detail here. And you have the option to not to have this log as well by setting a property. And then you can see that there is a yellow stage in here. What it means is anything that is in a straight line with no yellow coded, which means that they will progress automatically, which means there's no human interaction required or manual intervention required for these stages to move forward. But once the integration is completed, then we are saying that, hey, there is a manual intervention required to deploy to a release environment. So in this case, what we are doing here is we deploy to a release instance where your application is up and running. I'll walk you through how that happened, but this is how you go deploy. And this deploy button is available based on your RBAC control, which I will again walk you through in the LDAP configuration, how you can control that. So basically, when you click on this, it will show you all the versions that's available for you to deploy. And versioning is another conversation, but guide rails versions every build as it's a new version. So that's why you will see that there are a ton of version that gets created, and I just deployed the latest version. And this is not a production, so that's why you see all 00. This last patch version keeps on increasing for every build. And that's what you will see here, and you will have many of them for you to available to deploy if want to roll back to the previous version for any reason, right? And selecting on a specific version will give you what are the changes that's going to be deployed compared to the last version that is already deployed, right? So because I already deployed this one, so it shows you every feature that's been deployed so far into that environment. And of course, just deploy will kick off a deploy, and it will log who really deployed and what time the deployment was kicked off. So we get that information.
Oh, Jürgen, one more question on that. So as we think about doing upgrades, again, where we have persistent content, so in our test environment, I can envision that there's like two scenarios where we have, you mentioned before about having like a database like on an externally mountable, device, and then you can, do the deployment. We will have situations where we want to have this pipeline deployed like a brand new version. So it would be creating an empty schema, and, deploying our software on that. And then we'll have another configuration where we'll want to deploy it to an existing, database and perform an upgrade. Could you talk a little bit about like, we could have both of those scenarios in our test environment. Could you talk a little bit about what your suggestions would be for how we handle that?
Sure. So let me understand that. So from the same branch, you want to deploy in two different ways. Is that
well,
correct?
Yeah. So we, in our case, like, so we're deploying like, our software like for our customers, and for any version that we're working on, a single version could be to a new customer in which we'll be deploying an empty schema and, the product. And that's one test scenario. And there's another one where, our customers have existing data, and then there's upgrades that need to be performed to get them to the new level and bring the content forward. So we need to be able to test, both of those pathways from a deployment standpoint.
Okay. So if it is going to be used from the same artifacts, then we'll have to, talk about it and how do we support that for you. But if it is it's an automated deployment where you based on a flag, which based on a properties that set, hey, it's a new deployment or it's a upgrade, then we could spin up the entire new instances for that, not attach the existing deployment. So it's interesting. We can, maybe I'll work with Robert to figure out, and maybe we'll have a separate call about how do we support that part. Robert, do you have any insight before I? All right, that's fine. So we'll, I think we talked about it a long back, Al, about how do we do customer deployments through Guardrails. And I thought we were thinking more towards having a pipeline per customer in Guardrails so that you will be able to deploy. But I understand in your case, within the same customer, you want to deploy in two different ways. So.
Well, again, I don't want to take too much time on it, but it's more just from like, I'm thinking internally for deployment, we need to be able to test both pathways.
Okay.
So, and I was just curious as to how the pipeline would, how you'd suggest we structure to be able to handle that.
So we could do that.
It's not really but then it's the integration testing stage where we need to enable that, right? Or am I, or is this or am I not thinking? I feel like I may be missing the context or thread here, conversation thread.
Oh, well, maybe we could just take this offline. I don't want to derail your presentation.
Sure, no worries. No, they're good questions. I mean, that's your everyday usability, right? I mean, we should be able to address all that. Let me dive, if there are no questions on this, let me dive into the configuration itself. Are there any questions before I get there? Awesome. So this gear icon will take you to the configuration, or you can navigate from here on the hamburger here with the configuration console. This is also easy navigation between getting back to your dashboard, engineering console, and then you can run some reports and look at the status and all that. But clicking on this will directly take you to this specific pipeline configuration. What's happening here is there is a guideRail.json that's get created part of this configuration. So if you go to your ET, you see that on the guideRails branch, we have a folder called CI. So this is where the guideRail.json sits in. And this is the only file guideRails modifies when you do any changes to onboard. This is the pipeline as configuration. That's one of the DevOps principle. Keep your configuration within your source code, and guideRails only touches this. Nothing else in your repo will be touched by guideRails, right? And so we can go through the properties a little later, but let's get to the details configuration of the build itself. So this is a task, which is a task means it's a list of tasks that you want to do as part of your build. In this case, we spelled out a lot more here. We don't need to be doing all the steps, but in this, just for example, we added every step to be different. In this case, in the ET example, we had the npm install, run the test, and build it, and run the audit check, and then copy the coverage report. So we spelled out one step at a time. But this can be customized to however you need. If you have one build script that you want to do, like usually create a npm run build, right? That's usually done standard practice, which does all this, takes care of all this. It's fine. But this is how you can add more and more steps, and then Plus will let you add more steps, right? And then if you want to rearrange them, you can rearrange them one at a time. You can keep moving them, up and down. That's what you do. And then when you have to have a Docker image. So this is a situation where you need to be able to, you want to build on top of a existing some Docker image, because remember, guideRails provides a container every time you are going to build a new container. It's not a pre-existing container, which means every time it's a new build, which makes sure that you do not have a previous dependencies and everything sitting in that box, right? That's what gives you a confidence that every time you build, it is going to work in every environment that you're going to be tested and deployed. So, but if you have some pre-requirements where you need to build on it, some Docker image, you can provide the Docker image, and then we will be pulling that Docker image, and then we'll be executing these steps on top of that Docker image. And you can add multiple tasks. This is one task, and you can add the same way multiple tasks, and they can all run on a different Docker image if need be. So that's how you configure on the build task. Any questions here? Awesome. And the second important thing about here is the packages. So packages is something that you define in build and use in your deployments. So I think in this case, we needed a Node. When we say deploy, we are deploying to an AWS EC2 instance, where it's we spin up that instance with no pre-baked software in there, just a bare minimum EC2 instance that comes up. And what we are saying here is, hey, I needed, because when in your case, when you want to deploy, you need a Node.js application. And we said, hey, this is Node.js, I need a Node.js for to deploy. And then there are some install instruction, and also there is a mark here that corner of each box that we have, which you will let you expand it. It's not very intuitive, I understand, but it's something for you to keep in mind. And what do we do with, how do I install Node.js? So you can provide the steps in there, and then you can add the dependencies. If this Node.js is a dependent on some other package, we build that based on that dependency. And then the second one is just your application. So if you notice that you have a double parenthesis with application.name. What this means is defaults to your component name that's created. In this case, it'll be ET. It can be whatever you want to name it, of course. And what we are saying is take everything in from my repo, because this is a Node.js application. We wanted all the artifacts that was generated out of here to be packaged up. So, or you can customize that. If you, through your build, you only build a zip or a tar file, which needs to be packaged, you can specify that here. Okay, so that is what, how you configure the packages, and those packages will be available for you to use later down in your segments. In this case, we added both Node.js and application in both integration and release segments, but it's your option. If you don't want a Node.js here, because let's say you're deploying to a pre-existing instance where everything else installed, you don't need to select that. So that's the flexibility you have. So we'll go deeper in the later sessions about all other options, because there's a ton of options that you will be able to configure. And then what else I want to touch on? And properties. So properties are straightforward name value pairs, and you define them. It's available for you as an environment variable. Click on them, it'll be available. And then you can add more properties. And the properties that you will be available for you in each segment is all the properties that you have defined here so far in your entire hierarchy, and any new property that you have added here will be available for you with one conditions there, of course. So let's get to properties a little bit. So we have two types of properties here. One is something which is green, which they are secrets, which means that they do not have a plain text value. They are stored in Vault, and you will not be able to read that, see that value anywhere in Guardrails. It'll be a runtime available only, and those will never get displayed anywhere because it'll get redacted. All the logs, everything you will see, anything that's set as a secret, those properties will not be displayed anywhere in Guardrails. And you have a regular property, so which is just a key and a value. And you can see some parentheses, which means that somebody has defined it. I want to reuse that property. Somebody has already defined the customer.name to be PMI. I want to just reuse it. You could reuse that, or you could just use customer.name as well. So that's an option there. But you can see there are two options here. One is a lock and unlocked, right? This is locked and this is unlocked. What does this mean? This applies to both secrets and the regular property. What does this mean is, if in the higher up, in your hierarchy, in your, let's say in your PMI organization, somebody says a value of a property and a secret is that, and I lock it, that means that somebody using it, even though they are overriding it in their lower level, they will not get that value at runtime. The value that they will see at runtime is this value. Even though if I come here, for example, let me see, I copy this, for example, I copy this, I say that, hey, add a new property with this, and I want to mention as, right, just some default value. So I save this. Because this property is locked, even though you define the values different, you will get this value at runtime. This makes sense? So this is how you control what property can be exposed and overridden as you move through the pipeline, and what property you do not want to do. This is maybe like your production DB passwords, or the number of useful things that you can do here with these properties and log them, and applies to your quality gate as well. I'll come back to that. So that's that's about properties. Any questions?
I have one question. As I understand, all of these options, including properties, we can define in Whiterice configuration file in repository, or what kind of options we can define in the configuration file in the repository.
So yeah, anything that you see on the right side, right? So let's say this is the context that we need to understand in guide-rails. This context, when you are on a branch, which means even though we are showing you all the properties that was defined in a higher up, anything that is defined in blue are the only ones that will are defined at this level, and anything that's defined at this last branch level is going to be in your guide-rail.json. What I mean is, if you go to, for example, in this case, like static security scan, Veracode scan, get some example there. If you go to guide-rail.json, if I look for that, probably you will see that, right? Because this property was defined at the branch level, but you will not see this one anywhere in your guide-rail.json because this is defined higher up. Oops, somebody defined that? Oh, that's okay. This is defined, if you see here, this is defined as a dependency, and you don't really know the value of that. I'll come to this, what this means. Bear with me on that. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, and anything that you define up to component level, they are not in your guide-rail.json, they are in our system, and they will be applied on runtime. And how can you use your properties by default, right? So if you see the Notion, we have it as a dot. Note that as long as your the properties that you define has a shell or a PowerShell compatible, then you're good. So these things automatically converts to underscore. The dots will get automatically convert to underscore during runtime, and your export value for this by default will be all uppercase with underscores, right? This is what you will default behavior of guide-rails will all uppercase. This is your environment variable that's available. All this are exposed to you as environment variables, and this is how you will get that. But you can choose to name different environment export name if you want to, but convention is default. If you don't have this, we expose it that way, right? And secrets, again, they're all available for you as well as an environment variable runtime, which you can use it. And there is a small icon here which will tell you all the properties and where they are defined, and also it will tell you, where if it's locked, which means that even though someone else down the line defines this, they will not be able to over it. See, this one will tell you what is the property that will be in effect when your pipeline runs. So in this case, this was locked at a company level, and you will anyone using this property will get this value, and the company level is where it is defined. Okay, so this will give you a view of the entire property list. All right. And then we have these files are what is your start script for your service. We created a start service.sh. This is just telling that during the deployment, how do I start your application? How do I stop your application? And in this case, we just have a start. Stop will be automatically killing your process, of course, gracefully, but you can provide a stop script or a command, how you want to stop your application. So that's what you provide here. And you can even customize. So the way is, how does guide-rail figures out that, hey, your deployment is successful, or, how do I know when you do integration, I mark your deployment as successful. So what does is deployment strategy, right? It's a combination of deployment strategy and this configuration lets you decide, guide will decide what to, how do we mark them. So what we are saying here is this is your start script and this is your process name, which is PM2. And guide rails looks for the process called PM2 after running this, and then it waits for minimum 60 seconds to check on the process and waits until 120 seconds. So in this, after this duration, if your process PM2 is not up and running, it'll retry for 3 times, and then after that, it'll mark your deployment as failure. Okay, so you have a way to control that, how long you want. If you are a long-running a process which takes a while for you to start up your servers and stuff, you can configure them. This makes sense when we have more than one instance. So if you have 3 instances of integration we want to bring up, then canary, you can say, hey, I want to deploy to the first instance first. If it's failure, don't test the other ones. So you can configure those. And how many max in flight means how many in the instance groups you want to start updating. This makes sense, as you say, as I was saying, if you have 4 or 5 instances, I want to start with update 2 instances to start with, then you have that option. And we worked through the persistent. If you are going to say that persistent, it will stay up and running for you. And then you can make source code available. The source code is available only in your build segment, right? But if you still need a source code in your later down your segment, you can just check the box that I need a source code, and we will make the source code available for you in the respective segments, right? So there was another, Al, that I think to answer your question, there's a couple ways we can handle your multi-deployment as well. So let us say you want to deploy 2 different ways, right? One with bringing up a new, entirely new, so we can make things, oops, did I do that wrong? Let me delete that. I want to do a parallel. So the way is you click on this, it'll open up the segments that's available for you to add. And there's already one called release here. If I choose a different segment, it'll become parallel, and that's how you run parallel. So you can have one deployment going with this configuration and a second deployment going with this configuration. So, and then we can go adjust that configuration details inside here. This is an instance group. What instance group means is a VM coming up on your EC2 or any of your deployment target that we have defined. So you have an option to change how many instances and which region you want to go within AWS. In this case, we are deploying to AWS, and then you can choose a different VM type. Defaults means that you guys will use the default VM type, but you need a bigger or a more powerful VM types that you can choose for you to there. And then you can add a persistent disk types as well. And then also which network out of this you want to deploy. We try to keep the development to develop in a sense build. DMZ is your public network, and these are your integration, isolation, testing, and production release networks. In this case, we were on a release group, so we are on a release network. But you can choose to deploy where you want to. It's flexible. And OS type, right now, we support Ubuntu and Windows and CentOS. So you could say, hey, this is the OS type I want to bring up. Then, any questions so far? Or you guys are getting bored? Or am I going too fast? Oh, that silence is good, right? I know there's a lot, and we can schedule a smaller meeting chunks to go over in details if you guys have questions. But this is how you add a dependencies. In this case, you can see that we added MySQL as a dependency. Console we add by default for everything because this is the service discovery we use. And then we have some log rotate and BPM so that you can control your logs, how much logs to sit in the VM. And then we have a router registered as well. So you can register your, this was done so that we can create a DNS for you guys. We use a Go router there. So, but the most interesting is the SQL, MySQL that we are bringing up. And you can see MySQL exposes few properties that you can dynamically change. In this case, this is a secret that we have defined, and we are just using that at runtime. But you can provide the different values if you need to. Well, this is how you add a dependency. If you want to add a new dependency, you just click on it. Let's say you want to bring up Cassandra, for example. You bring up Cassandra, and then you can choose the list of versions available. We recommend keeping it to latest, because what this means is there is a pipeline in Guardrails that has deployed Cassandra as its own, which is somebody has created a release for Cassandra. That means it's available for you to consume it. So if you want to pin to a specific version to test, you can still pin it, but latest is the default. And then we have option of testing against a integration version of Cassandra. Why do we need these kind of options? This is important. Let's say you have 2 projects running in parallel and you want to be able to test before moving to prod the other project's integration part of it, right? So they deployed the integration, but you want to consume that artifact, not what's in production. So this is how you can control that, and lets you, test against other projects' integration artifacts, right? That's the flexibility. And these are directly in correlation to the number of segments that you will see on the top. Based on that, they will have it. If you have a isolation, you will see another option here called isolation. That's what that is. And then when you drop down, right now you need to know what properties that this dependency requires. We are going to enhance that to bring those properties automatically for you as we go. We're working towards that. But right now you will have to provide like if Cassandra needs a username to come up, and if you want to override that, so you can say whatever the property name that username, right, and provide the values. So this is all will be available, and anything that you're configuring here is what you will see it in guided.json. That is why you see PMIDB password as PMIDB password in here, because we added, let me remove this. I think we added the PMIDB password as your one of the, what do you call, properties. So that is what you will see in your guided.json, okay? Any questions so far? And Al, so you were talking about your inclusion exclusion patterns. This is how this code analysis defaults to Sonar right now. And then you can add, you can configure exclusion patterns here. Or, if you remove that, it'll just include everything based on the language preference. And you can also add, test paths here, test exclusions. So because when you do coverage, you want to make sure that you don't include your tests as part of your code coverage, right? Because that's your tests. So you can exclude them. Or you can provide a custom property file that will be applied during runtime, and you can have any number of Sonar related properties in there, okay? And also this controls whether you want to run a code analysis or not. If you don't want to run it, you have an option to disable that. And this is, again, configurable at every level. You will see that they're all configurable in this case, we configured at the component level. So it's a display only in the rest, but you can configure it any level as your need basis, right? that's that. And then there is, you might have a question, how do we connect to your Bitbucket? How do we pull your source code? And they're all based on the tool configuration. So we have created a, working with Walid, we created some tool chain. We are pointing to your Bitbucket. All you are doing is, if you see that we created, you just use an alias that was created. When you want to onboard a new component, you will just come and add a SCM. It will ask you by default, and you just say PMI Bitbucket. That will connect to your, that will use at runtime, it'll use the credentials configured based on this alias and pulls your code. As long as that has the access to read, we will be able to pull your code. And this will controls what type of language or a template that you want to use. This drives what is the default build template that you will get. Means what softwares get installed part of your build, right? Having a Node.js and coming to build will have a default Node.js container come up for you to run all the tasks, right? So this drives what container you will get by default. Where is it? Oops, did I mess up something? No, sorry. If you select Java or a CPP, you will get a default CPP container to run the builds against, or a default Java container to run the builds against. So that's what this template will drive you. And then your clone URL, we have configured with SSH. So you will provide a clone URL, and then you will see all the branches. So if you want to onboard a new branch, all you need to do is go open this. In this case, it will look for guideRail.json inside that branch. If there is none, you will see that, and you will be able to configure them, right? And then you can add more segments.
A question here.
Yeah.
Can we configure the path of this guideRail.json file? The reason I'm asking, I'm just wondering if there is a way to have or to define multiple pipeline for the same repo, like multiple different pipeline.
So it does, no, we don't. So the reason is, so your pipeline as configuration decides, every change that you want to make to that specific pipeline, if need basis, will live in that branch. If you have one master configuration, and then you will not have an option to make changes to the branch pipeline, right? At the end of the day, in your case, they will all get merged to either developer or a master branch. They will, when you branch out, they will automatically have a guideRail.json. You will see them automatically here. But in this case, we just did a guideRails. It's not a master branch. And that's the reason you will, once this branch gets merged, all other branch will automatically get that, right? And also we have not enabled auto onboarding. Once you onboard master branch, what happens is when you create a feature branch, they will be auto onboarded in guideRails. So you do not have to onboard manually. They will be auto onboarded, and you will start seeing those pipelines automatically kick off without user intervention. Yes, Walid, yes, to answer your question, there's no master guideRail.json for your entire repo. All right, and this just gives you a webhook setup. How do we set up a webhook? You can do that, and then, I think Walid, do you remember we did set up a webhook, right?
Yeah, for the ET project, we set up that.
Okay, yeah. And then just to test this, just to make sure that before you get on further with it, your credentials that is used here and the clone URL, we are able to successfully test it. Oh, in this case, it's SSH. Sorry, for SSH, you won't be able to test it because for SSH, we will have to clone the repo to test it. So, all right. I know we are getting at the top of the hour. We don't want to take too much time as well, but are there any questions? I know we covered a lot of ground today.
Yes, I have one more question. Can we integrate any kind of third-party static code analysis? I mean, for example, can we use CLang or CPP check? Because, for example, we would like to, let's say, we would like to create a custom checks for specific statements or part of code which cover our custom coding wine rules. That is for this kind of work. For example, CLang is best because it is highly customizable and allows to create custom checks in simple way. Is there a way to use CLang here for static code analysis or some
yes
other tool?
Yeah, so for code analysis right now, the default behavior is SonarQube, right? But it does not stop you from using any other code analysis tool. But that right now, that's limited to after build. The reason, so you can bring in any tool as a dependency in guide rails. So there are two ways of doing that. Either you define a CLang binary available, and you can say where to get it from and define a package for it and be able to use it, or create a CLang as a project itself and just let it run through the pipeline, just right. I mean, simple, it's going to just download your CLang probably. I don't know how the CLang works behind the scene, probably it's just a binary, right? And you can include them as a dependency, and you can make the source code available and in your integration, and you should be able to run a job steps to run your CLang against it. How do we consume the reports? Yes, so GuideRail supports default few reports. Anything that you do in any of your segment, if you provide a XML format of the report, which is very close to like a standard XML with a JUnit type of XML reports. And so we can show you here what happened here. So let me walk you through that. What happened here is that there is a coverage that's being run. Just an example here, we do consume Kobayashi coverage by default. So we don't have to copy this. But the thing is that anything that you provide an XML with a coverage.xml or test.xml or reports.xml, which is reports is usually for standards like a lint, security bugs and stuff. It's called report.xml. And if that's available for us to consume, we parse this behind the scene and aggregate all these results into your static analysis task that you see on the engineering console on the right side, right? So if you are going to run a custom tools, you can generate that kind of files and we will be able to consume. But if there is a tool that you need for us to integrate, we can work with you and make that to be a default behavior for you as well. Does that sound okay? Sorry, I didn't capture the name.
Yes, thanks.
So, I mean, we are getting so top of that. I don't want to go too much details of all the configuration available because it will be too overwhelming and it will be really confusing. So I think I encourage you guys. You guys all have logins now. See if you guys can log in, play around with it, shoot a question. We have we have a meeting every alternate days as a touch base with Walid. You guys can welcome to join or shoot questions to support@calculi.com or to myself or to Robert. Just feel free to shoot your questions on anything, right?
I would recommend just showing the Qt libs.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, repository too.
Qt libs, I think it's a CPP. Right now, we only configured with build. And I think with Wallet's help, we integrated the CPP, open CPP coverage, and we were able to get some coverage part of it. We need to validate Wallet, whether this is the right coverage. Of course, we need to add the exclusion criteria maybe, but this is the default, what we got. And what do you want to see particularly in this, Yang? Anything specific?
Oh no, just to kind of inform people that this exists, because
okay,
several of the remote race here are doing the C++ part. So
yeah.
wanted to.
Yeah, cool. And we already got the test metrics. We are upgrading the prod with the latest release of code quality because we are passing the C-test logs. We implemented passing the log file to get the test. We will get that upgraded for you guys. And then, yeah, there is a configuration you can look through how that is configured as well. And Wallet has been really helpful to get all this onboarded. Actually, Wallet is an expert in guide rails right now. All right. You guys let us know when you guys log in. You guys, so one before I end, how do we control whether you have access to the configuration console and what level of permissions we have, right? So let's go to PMI. So we created two groups, PMI dev and PMI admins. I haven't added the new people into the right groups yet. I can work with Yang and figure out, and Al and Wallet to figure out which group they appropriately belong. We have read permission. That means that you will be able to view every pipeline under PMI if you belong to this group. And execute means you will be able to kick off a run, right? When you make a commit, it does not require you to come and do anything in guide rails. If the pipeline is onboarded, it will automatically run no matter who commits to that branch, whether you are part of this or not, it does not matter because it's a commit to a repo and the pipeline is onboarded in guide rails, you will see pipeline getting kicked off. And when you have admin permissions, that's when you can come to admins and you can add properties, and these configurations are allowed, including all the way up to your branch level, right? So you will be able to come and make changes to your configuration only if you belong to PMI admins. And this can be controlled at every level. And of course, when you have the same PMI admins, let's say I want to add a new one with the same PMI admins, highest privilege prevails at the end. Because if you give read access here, but you already given admin access before, you will get the admin access. But you can create more groups. We can create more groups for final control, or we can go even individual level and say, hey, well, it's a person, one person needs to only have a read access. We can get to that level of what do you call RBAC controls. And the admins are the ones who will have option to deploy to manual gates. The one that we saw release deployment is that. So what I wanted to show you was just, so what we did with the release, oops, what happened? Why we terminated, sorry. It looks like we terminated that instance. We have already deployed, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. So we have deployed your application. Oops, why? Probably terminated that, sorry. So I'll get this up. This is available for you. I actually had sent an email a while back, the sample ET application getting deployed and available for, which will stay up, and I need to just check what happened, but this should be available for you. All right. Any questions? before we end, I know it's a 2 hour long. It was a really long meeting, but I hope this gives you guys a good start and start playing with guide rails.